Hey guys, welcome back. And thank you so much for joining me here tonight before you drift off to sleep. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight's story is a gentle retelling of one of the most iconic legends from ancient Greece, the story of Theseus and the Labyrinth. But unlike the versions you may have heard before, this one is told as a soft, dreamy epic, woven with peace, reflection, and quiet wonder. It's not a tale of loud battles, but of quiet choices, silent strength, and the kind of courage that walks barefoot through the world. Before we begin, if you enjoy relaxing stories like this one, please take just a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep telling calm, meaningful tales to soothe your evenings. I hope that by the end of tonight's story, you'll feel a little more at ease, and that you'll drift off into a deep, peaceful sleep with soft dreams and a quiet heart. Now, let's take a deep breath together and let the story begin. Long ago, in a time where the stars whispered secrets to the sea and the moon hung low like a gentle lantern in the sky, there lived a boy named Theseus. His cradle rested not in a palace, but in the tender hush of a quiet village on the coast of Troezen, where the waves brushed the shore with lullabies and olive trees rustled like pages of an ancient book. Theseus was born under the hush of twilight, wrapped in the arms of his mother, Aethra. She was a gentle woman, kind-eyed and full of old songs. Her voice often danced with the wind when she told tales of gods and heroes to her child, as if the stories themselves had wings and drifted into the night skies, lingering there like soft echoes. The villagers spoke in hushed reverence of Theseus's birth. They said his father was no ordinary man. Though he never walked the village paths or joined in the harvest, they whispered of a king from across the sea, Aegeus of Athens, who came and went like a dream. Some, in darker corners of the taverns, murmured that it was Poseidon, the god of the sea himself, who had fathered the boy. Either way, the stars seemed to lean a little closer the day Theseus opened his eyes. Theseus grew like a tree kissed by the sun. He was strong in limb, but gentler than most would expect. He listened more than he spoke. He watched the way the wind moved the tall grasses, the way old fishermen's hands danced as they mended nets, the quiet sorrow behind his mother's smile. He would sit for hours, fingers tracing the carvings on the old stone fountain in the village square, trying to guess the stories etched there long ago. One evening, as dusk brushed gold across the rooftops, Aethra took Theseus by the hand and led him to the temple atop the hill. The climb was silent, except for the crunch of small pebbles beneath their sandals and the hush of wind weaving through cypress trees. At the temple's heart stood a heavy stone, half buried, half forgotten. She knelt beside it, and with a voice barely louder than the breeze, she said, "Your father, whoever he truly is, left something for you here. Beneath this stone lies a sword and a pair of sandals. When you are strong enough to lift it, you may take them. Not before." Theseus stared at the stone. It was no mountain, but to a boy not yet 12, it seemed immovable. Still, he placed his palms upon it. It was cold, like water that had forgotten the sun. "I'm not ready," he said softly. Aethra smiled, brushing a dark curl from his brow. "Not yet, but one day." And from that day on, the stone was no longer just a stone. It was a promise, a whisper from the future. The years passed gently, like silk across skin. Theseus grew tall, like the pines along the ridges of Troezen. The other boys wrestled and raced, shouted and stumbled. Theseus moved, like poetry, graceful, aware, as though the earth itself guided his steps. His strength bloomed quietly, born not from boasting, but from patience. Each day he passed by the temple and the stone. Each time he laid a hand on its surface, feeling the slow pulse of fate beneath his fingers. And then, on a morning veiled in sea mist, the moment came. No horns blew, no gods sang, only the distant cry of gulls and the scent of rain hung in the air. Theseus walked alone up the hill. He knelt, palms pressed against the familiar coolness. He whispered not to the sky, but to the stone itself. And then, with the effort of years and the silence of purpose, he lifted it. Beneath, wrapped in aged cloth, were the sandals and the sword, both glinting softly as though they had waited, asleep, for his hand. He did not shout. He did not run home with triumph. He only sat a while in the temple's quiet, feeling the weight of the sword in his hands and the breath of destiny on his neck. That night, his mother stood in the doorway of their small home, watching the sea. "You're ready," she said, without turning. Theseus nodded. "There is a path waiting for you," she continued. "It winds far and wide, through shadows and sun. You must go to Athens and meet your father, King Aegeus. Not by sea, by land. The sea is fast, but the land is full of truth and trials." He did not ask why. He only embraced her, the way a tree holds to the earth that raised it. Later that night, while the village slept and the stars blinked gently above, Theseus sat by the fire. He traced the edge of his sword. It was neither large nor cruel. It was made for precision, for purpose, like him. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves of the olive trees, and somewhere far away, in the heart of another kingdom, a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man stirred in his sleep. The maze that held him sighed in its stone bones, sensing a thread had just begun to unwind. When dawn broke the next morning, the world seemed quieter than usual, as though nature itself had paused to watch the boy begin his journey. Theseus stood at the edge of the village, the sea behind him, the hills of the mainland rising ahead. A small satchel hung from his shoulder, the sword at his side, and the sandals, old yet sturdy, strapped to his feet like silent companions. The villagers watched from doorways and windows, their eyes soft and uncertain. No one called out. No one clapped or cried. In places like Treason, people understood the language of farewells. It wasn't spoken. It drifted in glances and lingered in silence. His mother stood at the garden's edge, her hands folded in front of her, her hair braided back the way she always wore it when saying something final. "I've packed figs, dried meat, and flatbread," she said, offering the satchel with a gentle smile, "and a small jar of honey. You'll need sweetness along the road." Theseus bowed his head, accepting the satchel. "I'll come back one day. Only if you still remember the stories," she said softly. "Athens may give you a crown. The world may give you fame. But if you forget the stories, you'll forget who you are." He nodded, then without another word, turned toward the path that wound up into the hills, into the unknown. The road was not like the ones sung about in heroic songs. It was narrow, sometimes broken, often lonely. But it moved like a thread, winding through sleepy olive groves, beneath sun-flecked canopies, and past slow rivers that sang in low voices. Theseus walked as though he belonged to the rhythm of the land. He did not rush. He greeted shepherds, listened to birds, sat by elder trees whose bark bore scars older than kings. At night, he camped beneath the open sky, his sword resting beside him like a loyal friend. The stars blinked kindly down, and sometimes when the wind was still, he could almost hear the voices of the old stories floating just above the treetops. But the land, as his mother had said, was full of trials. It was on the fifth day that he met Periphetes, the club bearer. The path twisted through a valley of dark oaks, where even at midday the sun felt shy. Birds hushed their songs, and the air held a stillness that made the skin prickle. Theseus walked cautiously, hand brushing the hilt of his sword. Ahead, by a moss-covered stone, stood a figure, tall, hunched, with a thick iron club resting on one shoulder. His beard tangled with leaves, and his eyes were small, sharp points beneath a heavy brow. "A traveler," the man grunted, stepping into the path. "What brings a soft boy into my woods?" "I walk toward Athens," Theseus said, steady and calm. The man laughed, a low, gravelly sound like stones grinding underfoot. "Then walk no more. Leave your sword, your sandals, and whatever food you carry. That is the toll." Theseus tilted his head slightly. "What if I pay you with a story instead?" The man blinked, caught off guard. "A story?" "Yes," Theseus replied. "Of a boy who lifts a stone, of a sword that waits, of a mother's song carried by the wind." The man's lips curled. "I care nothing for tales." "Then perhaps," Theseus said, drawing his blade with gentle grace, "I will teach you one." The battle was brief. Periphetes was strong, but he was slow, and his arrogance made him careless. Theseus moved like water through cracks in stone, measured, silent, inevitable. With the flat of his blade, he struck the club bearer down, not to kill, but to remind. When it was done, Theseus left him there, alive but humbled, and carried the club with him. Not as a trophy, but as a memory of the moment when silence defeated noise. In the days that followed, word traveled ahead of him. Soft whispers on the wind, like smoke curling beneath doors. "A boy walks the land," they said. "A boy with a blade of quiet and a heart carved from patience." Soon, he met Sinis, the pine bender. The man lived where two great trees leaned toward each other across the path. He had the strength of a storm and the cruelty of someone who had forgotten how to weep. His sport was dreadful. He tied travelers between the trees, bending the pines back until they flung the poor souls apart. When Theseus arrived, Sinis grinned with delight. "Another plaything," he said. "I will make the trees sing." Theseus said nothing. He walked forward with calm steps, as if greeting an old friend. Sinis charged like a wave crashing toward the shore, but Theseus was the still stone beneath the wave. He dodged, waited, moved, and when the moment was right, he used the trees themselves, looping ropes, turning strength into trap. In the end, Sinis hung limp between the very trees he once used for torment. Theseus stood beneath the swaying pines, breathing in their scent, eyes half closed. "Even trees remember justice," he murmured. By the time he reached the flat lands near the Isthmus of Corinth, his name had become Windsong. He helped an old woman gather her spilled figs by the roadside. He lifted a cart for a man whose ox had fallen lame. He told stories to children in a village square and repaired a broken flute for a blind shepherd. Everywhere he went, he did not act as a prince or a warrior, but as someone listening, observing, remembering. And the land, in turn, listened back. But deeper in the shadows, other names stirred, dangerous names, names that breathed through teeth and claw. The road was not done with trials, and neither was fate. That night, Theseus camped beneath a sky veiled in cloud. The fire was low, the earth cool beneath his blanket. In the dark, He could hear the chirp of insects, the crack of twigs, the quiet murmur of distant water. And somewhere far away, beneath stone and maze, the Minotaur's breath rattled in its chest. The thread had not stopped unwinding. The road, though still winding, had begun to change. No longer wrapped in green or gilded in golden light, it now carved its way through dry hills, where crows circled slowly above, and silence hung heavy like a curtain. Theseus pressed onward, his pace steady, his eyes always soft but alert, like the hush before a storm that is yet to break. He met few travelers here. Those who passed him kept their gazes low, their mouths tight. They spoke little, and when they did, their words carried warning. "Beware of Siron," said a merchant with cracked lips and frightened eyes. "He waits by the cliff. He smiles, but his hands betray him." Theseus thanked the man and offered a fig from his dwindling supply. The merchant blinked in surprise, nodded, and walked on, perhaps a little less alone than before. That evening, as the sky blushed with dusk and long shadows pooled along the rocks, Theseus arrived at the edge of a high cliff. The sea below churned slowly, reflecting faint shades of lavender and coral. It was a place of beauty, but also of sharp edges. A man stood there, tall and broad, with hair like carved bronze and a smile that shone too brightly. At his feet, a trail of scattered bones lay half buried beneath pebbles and sea salt. "You've come far," the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Theseus nodded. "I seek the road to Athens." "Ah," the man said, gesturing with an open hand. "But the path grows narrow here. I offer a kindness, you see. I help travelers wash their feet before they continue." Theseus looked at the cliff edge, then at the man's polished sandals, too clean for someone who lived on this dusty path. "And after the washing?" he asked softly. The man's smile deepened. "After, I let them rest." Theseus took a step forward, drawing no blade. "Then perhaps, before you offer kindness, you should receive it." He knelt and removed his own sandals. The man blinked, uncertain. "What are you doing?" Theseus reached for a small water skin. "I offer you the service you forced upon others, but freely. Let me wash your feet." The man's pride, fat and brittle, could not refuse. He sat. And in that moment, Theseus moved, not with speed or fury, but with the calm certainty of a tide returning to shore. He used the man's own arrogance to tip him from balance and sent him tumbling down the very cliff he had ruled. The sea, ever watchful, received Siren's final tale in a swirl of foam and silence. Theseus stood at the edge for a long time, the wind threading through his hair. "The road clears when pride falls," he whispered to the sea. He walked on. The next trial came not in form of a monster or murderer, but of a city. He arrived in Eleusis, where the fields rolled gold and soft green, and the people worked in quiet rhythm with the seasons. But a shadow loomed here, too, not one of cruelty, but of ritual. King Circeon, ruler of Eleusis, challenged all passers-by to wrestling matches. He fought not to prove strength, but to dominate, to humiliate, and his pride demanded that he never lose. Travelers were forced to the ground and broken, left bruised and discarded. Theseus entered the town square with little fanfare. The people watched from afar, silent and cautious. "I hear the king of Eleusis loves sport," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Circeon, a man of muscle and ego, stepped forward, his chest bare, his hands wide. "Another challenger?" he roared. "Or another fool?" Theseus bowed slightly. "Only a traveler who believes that skill should serve, not destroy." The match began with no horns, no drums, only the sound of feet on dirt and the slow inhale of the watching crowd. Cercyon lunged like a boulder crashing downhill. Theseus danced, not in mockery, but in wisdom. He knew when to yield, when to shift, when to let strength pass him by like a wave. The older man grew angry, sloppy, and in a moment carved from patience, Theseus brought him gently, but firmly, to the ground. He did not strike. He did not boast. He helped Cercyon to his feet, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Let strength lift, not crush." The people of Eleusis whispered a new name that evening, not of a conqueror, but of a restorer. Theseus rested in the city for a day. He mended a child's broken wooden toy. He shared bread with an old man whose wife had passed. He listened to stories from a young girl who dreamed of growing apple trees. And when he left, the city was just a little lighter. Farther along the road, under the canopy of twilight and stars, Theseus came upon a lonely forest glade where the trees bent like they were bowing. The air was still. Birds had long since fallen silent. Here, he met Procrustes, a man who offered a bed to travelers. Only one bed, always one size. If the guest was too short, he stretched them. If they were too tall, he cut them. The cabin seemed peaceful, almost welcoming. Flowers grew near the door. A song drifted from inside, a lullaby. Procrustes smiled warmly. "You must be weary, traveler. Rest in my home. I promise comfort." Theseus tilted his head. "All are welcome?" "Of course." "And all fit the bed?" The man nodded. Theseus stepped inside. The bed sat at the center of the room, neatly made, painfully perfect. Without speaking, Theseus approached the bed. He lay down, not to rest, but to feel the shape of cruelty disguised as hospitality. He rose. "I thank you for your offer," he said kindly, "but your kindness is rigid. It bends no more than your heart." And with a movement swift and sure, Theseus dismantled the bed, piece by piece, beam by beam, until it could no longer harm another soul. He left the pieces stacked gently by the hearth, a quiet reminder. Outside, the moon had risen. The trees whispered their thanks. Theseus sat beneath one and looked toward the west. The road to Athens grew nearer, but so did something else. A pull, a thread, a song from across the sea, a song from Crete. By the time Theseus saw the rooftops of Athens, dust clung to his cloak like quiet proof of the miles he had walked. The path behind him was long, marked by trials not of rage, but of resolve. He had not shouted his name across the hills, nor sought banners to celebrate his arrival. Still, the wind carried whispers, and in those whispers, the city already knew. Athens shimmered in the distance like a dream woven in white stone. Its hills rolled like sleeping lions, temples perched atop them like crowns. The scent of laurel and olive drifted on the breeze, mingling with the faint trace of smoke from hearth fires not yet dimmed. As he stepped through the city gates, Theseus felt the hum of life all around him. Merchants called in melodic voices. Children chased the shadows of birds. Women in flowing robes carried baskets balanced like poetry on their hips. It was not the size of the city that stirred something in his chest, but the feeling that he had entered a place of story, of fate. He made his way quietly to the palace, nestled near the Acropolis, where the stones remembered ancient footsteps. The guards at the gate paused, uncertain. This traveler bore no signet, no scroll of summons, only calm eyes and a sword that seemed to rest more easily in silence than in battle. "I seek King Aegeus," Theseus said. The guards glanced at each other. Then one, sensing something unspoken, nodded and led him through. The palace was not grand, like the tales often told. It was simple, sun-washed, with columns worn soft by time and touch. Inside, the king sat on a wide, low throne of marble, wrapped in deep blue robes. His beard had turned the color of sea mist, and his eyes carried years of storm and memory. When Theseus entered, Aegeus leaned forward, as though the boy stirred something half remembered in his bones. "You walk like the sea, but you bring the scent of earth," the king said. Theseus bowed low. "I bring no name, only truth." He stepped forward and placed the sword and sandals before the throne. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Aegeus rose, slowly, as though a tide within him had begun to rise. "It was you," he whispered, "the sun the gods hid in time. I left the blade beneath the stone, thinking perhaps, one day." Theseus looked into the eyes of the man who had never held him as a child, but whose blood moved quietly within his veins. "I did not come for a throne," he said gently, "only to return what was promised." Aegeus stepped forward, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You've returned more than that?" And for the first time in many years, the king smiled without sorrow. In the days that followed, Theseus remained in Athens, not as a prince in silks, but as a listener, a watcher, a weaver of small kindnesses. He walked the agora, listened to stories of the old gods, helped lift stones in the rebuilding of a fallen wall, sat with the elderly, who no longer remembered their own names. He was not yet legend. He was simply present. But peace, like a candle in the wind, flickers before it fades. One dusk, as the city turned golden beneath the falling sun, a great horn sounded from the docks. A Cretan ship, large and dark-sailed, slid into harbor like a shadow come to life. At its prow stood a herald in crimson robes, holding a scroll wrapped in black ribbon. The people gathered, the king came, and the scroll was read aloud. By decree of King Minos of Crete, and in accordance with the tribute long owed by Athens, the herald declared, 7 sons and 7 daughters must be sent once again to the island of Knossos. There they shall enter the labyrinth and offer their lives to the one who dwells within. The square grew silent, the hush of grief folding over it like a shroud. Mothers clutched daughters. Fathers lowered their eyes. Children, too young to understand, simply stared. Theseus stood at the edge of the crowd, his jaw set, his hands still. After nightfall, he went to the palace garden, where his father sat beneath a fig tree, a goblet forgotten in his lap. "Is it true?" Theseus asked. Aegeus did not turn. "Yes. Years ago, I offended Minos. A cruel accident during games. His son died. And ever since, we've paid with our own, every 9 years. These people, they suffer because of you." The king nodded slowly. "And I have carried it in silence." Theseus stepped closer. "Then let the silence end." Aegeus looked up, weary and afraid. "What are you saying?" "I will go," said Theseus, "among the 14. The king's eyes widened. "Number you are the son I waited a lifetime for. And they are the sons and daughters of the people you swore to protect." Theseus answered. He knelt, not in submission, but in strength. "I must go, not because I am your heir, but because I am their hope." Aegeus, heart trembling, embraced the boy who had become a man. "Then take this," he whispered. "If you return alive, raise a white sail. Let me not grieve the sea again." Theseus nodded. Far across the waters, on the island of Crete, the labyrinth waited, a twisting maze of stone and shadow, and at its center, a creature whose breath echoed with hunger and sorrow, the Minotaur. But that night, in the stillness before the storm, Athens did not weep. Instead, it dreamed of a boy who walked like silence, of a thread not yet woven, of a story just beginning. The harbor of Athens glistened beneath the morning sun, its waters catching light like polished glass. Gulls circled overhead, calling in long, looping cries that echoed between masts and sails. The ship that would carry the tributes to Crete loomed like a dark monolith among the fishing boats, a massive vessel with a black hull, black mast, and a sail folded tightly like a sleeping wing. On the dock, 14 youths stood in quiet rows. 7 sons, 7 daughters. No chains bound them. No guards prodded them forward. They were volunteers, or at least that was the story told to keep the sorrow tidy. Theseus stood among them, his cloak plain, his sword hidden beneath it. He did not carry himself like a prince or a hero, but like someone rooted deeply into the earth, unmoved by fear. His gaze was soft but unblinking, fixed not on the ship, but on the sea beyond it. His presence brought a hush, even among the trembling hearts of those around him. One by one, the others stole glances at him, some with awe, some with comfort. It was not his fame, for few truly knew what he had done along the road. It was something else, a stillness, a quiet assurance that they were not walking into the dark alone. King Aegeus stood at the end of the dock, robes fluttering gently in the sea breeze. His face was lined with both age and unspoken grief. He had not argued again after the night in the garden. Some part of him knew the boy could not be stopped, only trusted. "Raise the white sail if you return," he said again, though his voice barely carried across the waves. "Let the sea bring me news before my heart does." Theseus bowed slightly. "The wind will know." Then, without a trumpet or farewell song, the ship pulled away, its black sail unfurling slowly, catching the morning wind like a breath held too long. The voyage began. The sea was both cradle and mirror. Days passed with little sound beyond the creak of wood, the splash of waves, and the murmur of whispered prayers. The 14 tributes slept in a single hold, with straw mats and salted bread. Their only comfort, the rhythm of the ocean and the presence of one another. Some wept at night, soft, trembling sobs muffled in sleeves. Some sat in silence, eyes fixed on the planks above them, as if memorizing the lines might keep the fear at bay. But slowly, gently, something began to shift. It began with small things. Theseus taught the youngest boy, Callion, how to tie sailors' knots, not because it was useful, but because doing something with his hands helped chase away the trembling. He sat beside a girl named Lisa and listened as she spoke about her family's vineyard and the way spring sunlight turned the grapes to gold. He carved a wooden figure, a tiny bird, for a girl named Ione who had lost her voice to grief. He did not lead them. He simply was with them. And in that presence, the 14 became more than tributes. They became a circle, a small constellation adrift on the sea. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the sky blushed with lavender and rose, the group gathered on the deck. A sailor, grizzled and quiet, allowed them to stand for a short while in the breeze. None of them spoke at first. The sea whispered all around them, and the stars began to prick through the velvet dark. "Theseus," one of the older boys, Damaris, finally said, "Do you believe we will live?" Theseus looked up, not at the stars, but at the faces around him, each one different, each one young, unfinished. "I believe stories live," he said softly, "and if we choose to carry one another, then no part of us will be forgotten, no matter what happens in the dark." They fell silent again, but this time it was a silence with warmth in it. That night, they all dreamed. And in their dreams, They were not hunted, not lambs sent to slaughter, but something else, something woven of light and memory, a thread. The island of Crete rose from the sea 2 mornings later, tall and proud, like the back of some sleeping creature. Knossos, its capital, gleamed with white stone and twisting courtyards. Frescoes danced along its walls, images of bulls leaping, maidens spinning, kings watching from thrones carved with lion paws. As the ship approached the harbor, trumpets blared from the docks. Cretan guards in bronze armor stood in formation, their spears like reeds in the morning light. The tribute ship docked without ceremony, but eyes watched from balconies and rooftops. Among them stood Princess Ariadne. She leaned against a marble rail, her eyes shaded beneath a thin veil. She had heard of the tributes, of course. It was an old rhythm in her land. Every 9 years, the sea delivered them. Every 9 years, they vanished into the labyrinth, and the island sighed in secret relief. But this time was different. She had heard whispers from her nursemaids, rumors from merchants. One name stood out like a flame among shadows, Theseus of Athens. And though she did not know his face, something stirred when she saw the tall boy step onto the dock. Calm, unchained, his eyes scanning the palace as though it were a place he had seen in dreams. She pressed a hand to her chest. A thread had begun to tug. Theseus and the others were led through winding streets toward the palace, not as prisoners, but not as guests either. Cretan banners flapped above them, painted with red bulls and curling mazes. Inside the palace, they were placed in a stone chamber. Food was brought. Water. No words. No promises. That evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and the sea turned to ink, a shadow moved through the halls. Ariadne, wrapped in silence and silk, made her way to the chamber. She stood beyond the door, her heart a tangle of fear and wonder. And when she finally stepped inside, her eyes found his, not the prince, not the hero, but the thread. And it had found her too. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast gentle flickers on the stone walls. The tributes had grown quiet, their bodies still, but their hearts restless. Sleep came lightly in this place, where the air tasted of dust and distance, and shadows stretched longer than they should. Then the door opened, without noise, without guard. A soft rustle of silk followed, and into the chamber stepped Ariadne, her figure wrapped in midnight blue robes, her veil now drawn back, revealing a face both regal and strangely young. Her eyes, the color of early twilight, met Theseus's with neither fear nor command, only curiosity, like someone who has found a familiar song in an unfamiliar place. The others stirred, some rising, unsure whether to bow or speak. But Ariadne raised a hand, not harsh, but gentle, like a breeze stilling a restless flame. "I did not come for ceremony," she said quietly. Her voice was calm, like moonlight on water. Theseus rose slowly. He stepped forward, not in defiance, but as one thread drawn toward another. "You are Ariadne," he said, "daughter of Minos." "I am," she replied, studying his face. "And you are not like the others." "I am Theseus," he said, "son of Athens." She tilted her head. The son who did not tremble when he stepped from the ship. "I have walked far," he said, "and learned that fear comes not from footsteps, but from forgetting why you take them." Ariadne was silent a moment. Then she crossed the room to a low bench and sat, her fingers resting lightly on her lap. "My people think of you as offerings," she said, as echoes of a punishment long past. "And what do you think of us?" A long pause. I think, she whispered, you are stories waiting to be told, and I grow weary of the ones told by others. Her eyes moved over the tributes, some half asleep, some listening from the dark, then back to him. Do you know what waits for you? She asked. Theseus nodded. The labyrinth and the beast. Ariadne's voice dropped even lower. The Minotaur. At the sound of the name, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. These walls are old, she said, older than kings. Beneath this palace lies a maze no map can hold. It shifts, it listens. At its center dwells the Minotaur, my mother's shame, my father's weapon. Theseus watched her closely. And you? I am its secret keeper, she said softly. I know the ways in, but not the ways out. Silence settled again. And in that silence, a truth passed between them, one without words, like the pull of the moon upon tides. Then help me, Theseus said, voice even. Help me find a way through. She did not answer at first. Her hands moved, unconsciously, to her belt, where a silver coil of thread was tucked, fine and shimmering, almost alive. You're not the first to ask, she said, but you are the first I believe. Then she rose, swiftly and with purpose, her silks whispering against the stone. Meet me tonight, she said, when the third torch along the hall burns low. Come alone, and come quietly. And like a shadow stepping back into itself, she left. That night, the chamber was silent, the others lost in uneasy sleep. Theseus waited. He counted the flicker of torches as the hours passed, watched the flame rise and fall until, at last, the third torch along the hall burned low, its light a faint golden hush. He slipped through the door, sandals silent against the cool stone. The palace at night was a place of echoes, footsteps long gone, whispers tucked in corners. He moved like memory through its corridors. Ariadne waited in a small garden courtyard where ivy curled along the walls and a fountain murmured a lullaby to no one. She wore no jewels, no crown, only a pale tunic and a cloak of soft wool. In her hands, she held the coil of thread. This, she said, lifting it, was spun by Daedalus himself, the builder of the labyrinth. It is strong. It remembers. Tie one end at the entrance. Hold the other. No matter how the walls shift, it will lead you back. Theseus took it gently. The thread was warm, almost pulsing, like it carried a breath of life within its length. And if I fail, he asked. You won't, she said, though her voice trembled faintly. He studied her, this girl, who had lived her life inside marble halls and shadowed corridors, yet had found the courage to defy a king and face a monster she would never meet. Why help me? He asked. Ariadne's eyes lifted to his. Because no one ever asked me if I wanted the labyrinth to be part of my story. And you are the first person I believe could unwrite it. Theseus nodded, then reached into the folds of his tunic and withdrew something small, a carved wooden bird. For you, he said simply. She took it with trembling fingers. What is it? A reminder that threads can also be wings. And for a long moment, they stood in silence. Not hero and princess, not offering and keeper, but simply two people on the edge of something ancient. When he returned to the chamber, the others were still asleep. But Theseus lay awake, the thread coiled near his heart, and far below them, beneath stone and secret, the Minotaur stirred. The maze had begun to listen. The sky was still veiled in a pale gray hush when the guards came. No horns, no shouts, just the creak of sandals on stone and the rustle of spears as the door opened. The tributes were woken one by one, not with cruelty, but with the practiced indifference of those who had performed the task many times before. Theseus rose calmly, as if he had only been resting, not sleeping. The thread lay beneath his tunic, coiled like a secret. He touched it once, gently, like one might press fingers to a pulse, to remind himself it was still there, still ready. Outside the chamber, a corridor stretched long and cold. Torches glowed along the walls, their light steady, but too warm, too bright, like they were meant to hide something rather than reveal it. The guards said nothing. The tributes were led through the belly of the palace, through narrow halls and downward steps that spiraled like a dream collapsing into itself. At last, they reached a vast stone door set into the earth, half covered by moss and age. Above it, carved in ancient runes, were words no one tried to read aloud. But the meaning lingered in the air. This is not a door. This is a beginning. A priest stepped forward, draped in red and gold. His voice, when he spoke, was thin as spider silk. Here begins the path. One by one, the chosen shall enter. The walls will not welcome you. The beast will not show mercy. Walk as shadows walk, and may the gods remember your name. No one moved. Then Theseus stepped forward. He said nothing to the others, only offered them a glance, a soft, steady look that said, "Hold on to the light." Then he turned and approached the door. Ariadne stood near the edge of the clearing, beneath a fig tree, watching. Her face was veiled again, but her hands twisted gently in front of her, fingers curled like the petals of a flower not yet ready to open. As Theseus passed her, he did not stop, but his fingers brushed the air just near hers, close enough for her to feel it, a silent farewell, or perhaps a promise. The stone door groaned open, and Theseus stepped inside. The labyrinth was not what he expected. It did not roar or breathe. It did not feel like a prison or a battlefield. It felt ancient. The air was cool, tinged with damp stone and something older, something like memory. The walls were smooth but not perfect. They curved and tilted, sometimes narrowing, sometimes yawning wide. The torch in his hand flickered as if the maze itself exhaled slowly around him. He tied the end of the thread to the doorframe before he descended. Its silver length trailed behind him now, taut but forgiving, like a line cast into mystery. Each step echoed differently. Some made no sound. Some made too much. And every so often, he heard it. A shift, a breath, a scrape, somewhere deep in the stone. Not near, but not far. The Minotaur, he thought, or perhaps the maze itself. Hours passed, or maybe only moments. Time did not walk here. It drifted. He marked his path carefully, not just with thread, but with thought. Each turn, each rise in the floor, each doorway that led to a false chamber. He watched. He remembered. Not like a warrior hunting prey, but like a listener deciphering music. In one chamber, he found the bones of a girl, her braid still clinging to a cracked skull. He knelt beside her, said no words, only bowed his head. In another, a broken flute lay near a wall. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, then placed it back, gently, like returning a feather to the wind. Then finally, the silence changed. It was subtle, like the breath before thunder, the stillness before the leap. He stepped into a wide, circular space. The walls here were higher, the air thicker. At the far end, in the dark, something moved. He did not run. He did not speak. He simply waited. And from the shadows emerged the shape, the Minotaur. It was taller than any man, its body broad and furred, shoulders like carved stone, horns that reached back like the arms of a tree pulled by wind. Its eyes glowed faintly, not with malice, but with sorrow, like a thing that had forgotten its own name. Theseus drew his sword slowly. "I am not your jailer," he said softly. The Minotaur snarled, a sound more like a shiver than a roar. "But I am your ending." It charged. The battle was not long. The maze did not watch. The walls did not cheer. There was no audience to gasp or sing, only the soft clash of steel, the grunt of breath, the scrape of hooves on stone. Theseus moved like he always had, with patience, with purpose, with the quiet certainty of a man who knew that victory was not noise, but knowing why you fight. He did not kill out of rage. He ended the Minotaur the way one closes a book whose final page has long been waiting. When it was done, he stood in the silence, chest heaving slowly. The Minotaur lay still, curled as if sleeping, and somewhere, in a courtyard above, a girl looked toward the sky and felt a thread go slack. Theseus gathered the thread, wound it carefully. Every step back was a memory, each turn a breath drawn deeper. The maze did not fight his retreat. It had seen what it came to see. And when he emerged at last into the light, the dawn was rising over Crete. He said nothing to the guards, nothing to the priest. He only looked to where Ariadne waited in the shadows beyond the trees. She stepped forward, and in her eyes there was no triumph, only relief and a quiet, trembling hope. The sun had not yet fully risen, but its breath warmed the edge of the sea, casting soft gold across the marble pillars of Knossos. Morning birds stirred gently in the gardens. The city still slept, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to know, that something ancient beneath its feet had ended in the night. In a quiet grove beyond the edge of the palace, Ariadne waited. Her hair was loose, falling down her back like strands of midnight silk. Her robe was simple, a traveling cloak, now wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Beside her sat a small satchel, packed not with riches or gowns, but bread, figs, and a single comb carved from olive wood. She had not cried, but her heart had not stopped trembling since Theseus disappeared into the stone mouth of the labyrinth. When he returned, silent and alive, covered in dust and old shadows, she had not rushed to him. There had been no cries, no falling into arms, only the meeting of eyes. He nodded once, and she understood. Now they stood together in the hush before escape. The others, the tributes, had already been quietly led to the harbor by a trusted servant of the princess. They waited there now, in a small cove where a fishing vessel, fast and unmarked, was moored and ready to sail. "You are certain?" Theseus asked. Ariadne looked out toward the sea. "There is no place for me here anymore. My father will know. And the labyrinth? It was always my cage too." Theseus paused. "And Naxos?" She nodded. "There's a small island there, quiet, unwatched, a place to begin again." He studied her, this girl who had grown up surrounded by power and silence, now choosing to walk into the unknown with nothing but faith and a thread that no longer held her. "I will keep you safe," he said softly. A faint smile touched her lips. "I'm not looking for safety, only truth." They walked together along the dew-dappled path, their footsteps barely disturbing the hush of the morning. The scent of laurel drifted in the air, mingled with the salt of the waking sea. No one stopped them. No one called out. Crete, it seemed, had closed its eyes for a moment, letting them pass like shadows at the edge of a dream. At the harbor, the others stood ready, tired, hungry, but no longer afraid. Theseus greeted them quietly. No speeches, no boasts. He nodded once, and they stepped aboard. Ariadne was the last to climb the plank. She turned once, just before stepping onto the deck. The palace walls loomed in the distance, pale and still. Somewhere within them, Minos would wake. He would rage. He would grieve. But for now, all was still. And then they sailed. The sea was calmer than it had been on the voyage to Crete. The waves lapped gently at the sides of the boat, and the sail, now white, bright as cloud, billowed softly in the wind. The tributes sat in quiet clusters. Some dozed. Others watched the horizon, their faces marked not with joy, but with the slow, fragile unfolding of freedom. Theseus stood at the stern, hand on the tiller, eyes scanning the water ahead. Beside him, Ariadne leaned into the wind, her cloak fluttering like a broken wing mending itself. "You were right," she said after a while. "The thread. It led you back." He nodded. "It led me forward, too." They sailed for hours, the island of Crete shrinking behind them until it became a smudge against the morning sky. Clouds drifted lazily above. Dolphins leapt in the distance, chasing nothing but joy. Then, as the sun climbed higher, a small island rose on the horizon. "Naxos," Ariadne whispered. It was beautiful, not with temples or walls, but with wild trees, golden beaches, and a mountain that looked like it had been sleeping since the dawn of time. There were no banners, no torches, just wind and earth and possibility. As the ship drew close to the shore, Theseus turned to her. "Will you come with us to Athens after you rest?" Ariadne shook her head slowly. This is where my path ends, for now. I need to be alone with the silence, to listen to myself, without walls." Theseus did not argue. He only nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. When they reached the shore, the others helped carry supplies and water to a shaded grove not far from the beach. Ariadne walked a little apart, touching the trees, kneeling briefly to press her fingers into the soil. It was not goodbye, not truly. Theseus approached her once more, holding something in his palm. It was the carved wooden bird he had given her in the palace garden. She had kept it close. He now handed her something else, a coil of thread. "It's yours now," he said gently, "to use, or simply to remember." Ariadne smiled. "Perhaps I'll use it to find myself." He kissed her forehead, a gesture soft as breath. Then slowly, he turned and walked back to the ship. As the sails rose again, white and sure, Ariadne watched from the shore. The wind caught her hair. The bird rested in her hand. She did not wave, nor did he look back. But in the wind, a promise lingered, and the sea, ever ancient and knowing, carried them both forward. The sea shimmered like glass, stretched wide beneath a sky pale with early light. The wind moved softly, brushing the sail of the Athenian ship, like a mother smoothing the hair of a sleeping child. The vessel glided gently over the waves, leaving behind the island of Naxos and the quiet figure of Ariadne on the shore, her cloak fluttering like a flag of farewell. Theseus stood at the bow, eyes fixed on the distant line where water met sky. The victory was behind him now. The Labyrinth conquered, the Minotaur defeated, the tribute saved. And yet, the quiet in his chest did not feel like triumph. It felt like a hush before a storm that no one yet knew was coming. The white sail above him, bright and full, pulled them onward toward Athens. It had been a simple request from his father. "Raise a white sail if you return alive." Theseus had agreed, and the sail now billowed with every breath of the sea, a glowing banner of hope. But something inside him stirred uneasily. He had not spoken much since they left Naxos. The others, his companions, The former tributes had begun to laugh again, though softly. They spoke of home, of families, of bread warm from the oven, of olive trees and sleeping under open skies. Theseus smiled when they smiled, but his thoughts wandered far beyond their laughter. He thought of Ariadne, of her fingers brushing the olive bark, of her voice in the quiet garden, of her eyes, still and full of longing, when she had said she would stay behind. He had not asked her to come again. He had not looked back as the sail rose. Somewhere in the stillness of his chest, a thread had frayed. On the third morning, the peaks of Attica came into view, soft and silver in the distance. Athens awaited, resting between hills, like a cup held between gentle hands. The ship turned slightly, its prow slicing through the shallows, the white sail catching the full glory of the morning sun. The harbor was already stirring. Fishermen mended nets on the docks. Children ran barefoot through the sand. When they saw the white sail, they stopped, and they began to run. From house to house, from market to temple, word spread like flame. The ship returns. The sail is white. By the time Theseus stepped off the vessel, a crowd had gathered. Not loud, not chaotic, just waiting. Their eyes wide, their hands trembling with the quiet weight of hope. Then came King Aegeus. He moved through the crowd like a man emerging from mist, his robes unfastened, his hair swept by wind. He had come to the shore each day since the ship's departure, waiting with eyes that never quite rested, watching each sail on the horizon, each speck that might grow into a vessel. Now he saw the white sail, and his heart, long bruised by worry, dared to feel lightness. He stepped forward. Theseus moved toward him. The crowd held its breath. And in that stillness, so thin, so fragile, something shifted. The king's gaze passed Theseus, and then faltered. He staggered. He looked again, and his eyes, dark and wide, fixed on the white sail, then on the boy's face. Then, with a sound like a breath breaking in two, Aegeus fell to his knees, and then he collapsed. The world stilled. Some cried out, some rushed forward. Theseus dropped beside his father, lifting him gently, feeling for breath, finding none. He had died in that moment, not of wound, not of poison, but of something older, of a thread too tightly pulled, suddenly snapping. The white sail had flown, as promised, but Aegeus had not seen it in time. In his old heart, he had looked upon the ship, seen its return, and somehow, in that blink of sun and shadow, had mistaken the color. He had expected black. He had feared it so deeply, so vividly, for so long, that even white could not erase it. And in that single blink of misbelief, his heart had given way. Theseus did not weep. Not then. He stood as the people gathered, as the servants came, as the priestesses whispered hymns of farewell. He stood beside the body of the father he had never truly known, surrounded by the city he had now inherited. The boy who had walked the land with bare feet and quiet purpose had returned a man with blood on his sword and loss on his shoulders. Aegeus was buried on the cliffs above the sea, the very cliffs where he had once watched the ship sail day after day with a silence deeper than prayer. From that day on, the sea beneath those cliffs bore his name, the Aegean, named not for the king who ruled, but for the man who waited. Theseus returned to the palace, not with fanfare, but with quiet footsteps. He walked through its halls like a guest, not a ruler. Servants bowed. Priests made signs of blessing. But Theseus only nodded, his thoughts still tangled like thread in the wind. In the garden, he sat beside the old fig tree where he had first promised his father he would go. The leaves were turning slightly at the edges now, summer ripening into fall. He closed his eyes and listened, not for applause, not for cheers, but for the voice of the wind. And in its hush, he heard nothing, only the turning of something unseen. The city of Athens woke slowly in the days that followed King Aegeus's death. There were no great parades, no blaring horns or flying banners, only the muted murmurs of mourning and the rustle of olive branches placed gently on doorsteps. The people lit candles in their windows at dusk. Children were taught to whisper near the palace walls. And every evening, the sea carried wreaths made of fig leaves and lilies out into the open water, where they drifted like tiny prayers without words. Within the palace, the halls remained hushed. Courtiers moved with soft sandals. Priests offered incense, their chants no louder than the flutter of doves. Everyone waited. For what? None could say. Perhaps for grief to settle, perhaps for a new voice to rise. But Theseus did not rush to claim the throne. He moved through the palace like someone still unpacking silence. He ate little, spoke only when spoken to. His hands, once so sure on the hilt of a blade, now rested often behind his back, clasped not in pride, but in thought. When the council met and offered him the crown, he bowed his head, not in acceptance, but in reflection. "I am no stranger to the path," he said, "but a throne is not a sword, and power is not the same as strength. Let Athens mourn her king. Let her speak for herself. When the time comes, I will listen." And so he waited. Each day he walked through the city, not with guards or fanfare, but alone. He visited the baker, whose son had been among the tributes, sat with an old woman who still spoke to the fig tree in her yard as if it were her husband. He watched children play near the edge of the agora, their laughter like flutes dancing on breeze. Some called him wise, some called him strange, but all agreed. He listened more than he spoke. One afternoon, beneath the long shadow of the Acropolis, a stranger arrived. He was wrapped in a traveler's cloak, his sandals dusty, his hair streaked with salt and sun. He carried no sword, only a small lyre slung across his back. He introduced himself simply. "I am Thalon of Delos. I carry songs." And carry them he did. He sang in the squares, beneath olive trees and market tents, his voice low and clear like river water over smooth stones. His songs were not of gods or heroes, but of fishermen lost at sea, of girls who danced on rooftops, of fathers who waited too long. One morning, as the sun stretched golden fingers across the stones of the city, Thalon stood before the palace and sang. A sail was raised, white as hope, yet the heart it meant to reach was already broken. A thread unwound across the sea, but some knots are tied too late. Theseus, hearing the words from his chamber, stepped onto the balcony and watched the man. He did not speak. He only closed his eyes and listened. That night, Theseus sat beneath the fig tree again, and for the first time, he whispered to it. "I did everything right," he said, and still, something was left undone. The branches stirred slightly in the evening breeze. The people began to gather at the palace gates, not to demand, but to offer. They brought oil and grain, olives and folded cloth, not as tribute, but as quiet signs. "We are ready. We trust you. Come stand among us." And so, after weeks of silence, Theseus entered the council hall. The crown, simple, gold, shaped like olive leaves, rested on a cushion of white wool. It did not gleam. It did not shine. It only waited. Theseus stood before it. "I do not take this for glory," he said. "I take it because this city has a voice, and I will be its echo, not its master." He placed the crown upon his head. No cheers rang out, no trumpets called. But every citizen, from the hills of Nyx to the docks of Piraeus, felt something shift, like the soil settling after a long rain. A quiet strength, a new beginning. As king, Theseus changed little at first. He kept the market open, spoke to fishermen, asked stonecutters how the winter affected their hands. He listened to disputes and invited both sides to speak until their anger softened into questions. He brought children to the temples and let them touch the marble so they could feel the bones of their city. He never raised his voice, but his presence was like a thread pulling the city gently into shape. He ordered the rebuilding of the west wall, where rain had worn the stones thin, not with guards, but with citizens working side by side. He knelt with them, lifted stone with them. And when an old mason asked why a king carried rock like any man, Theseus only smiled, "Because I too stand on this ground." But not all were at peace. There were whispers from beyond the city walls, men who questioned his softness, who grumbled that a king should rule, not walk among farmers. One such man, a wealthy merchant from the north, sent Theseus a cloak of red-dyed in Tyrian purple, embroidered with lions and lined with silver. Theseus returned it with a note. "I wear the dust of my people. It suits me better." That evening, alone in his chamber, Theseus sat by the window. The stars blinked above the darkened sea. Somewhere out there was Naxos. Somewhere, Ariadne still breathed beneath the same sky. He reached into a small box beside his bed and pulled out the thread she had given him. It had grown frayed at one end, but still it held. He wrapped it once around his wrist and lay down. Sleep came slowly, and in the silence before dreaming, he heard the sea whisper. It did not speak in words, only in the soft sound of turning. It began with a letter, folded in green wax and marked with the seal of the Isle of Delos, a quiet place of temples and wind, known more for prayer than politics. It arrived at dawn, carried by a young boy who trembled slightly when brought before the king. Theseus, seated beneath a trellis of blooming vines in the palace courtyard, took it gently from the boy's hand. He opened the letter without ceremony. Its words were simple. The temple of the Silent Mother has fallen ill, not by plague, not by war, but by forgetting. We ask for the one who listens. Come, not as king. Come as you are. Thalon. The name stirred something soft in Theseus's memory. The traveling singer from weeks ago, whose songs held sorrow like a bowl holds water. He read the letter twice, then again. By the time the morning sun touched the western pillars of the courtyard, Theseus had already packed. He told the council he would return soon. He left no guard in his place, no proxy. "Athens has many voices," he said. "Let them speak to one another." He wore no crown, only his old sandals, a plain cloak, and the thread still wrapped around his wrist like a silent vow. The ship that carried him to Delos was small, barely more than a fisherman's craft, but it moved swiftly, cutting through the Aegean with ease. The sea was gentler than before, as if it remembered him and made way. Theseus stood at the prow, watching the gulls spiral and the light dance on the waves. There was no triumph in his heart, no mission to conquer, only a quiet pull. Like being called, not with a shout, but a whisper. Delos appeared on the horizon by afternoon, an island of pale stone and gentle hills dotted with whitewashed homes and temples whose columns seemed to lean slightly toward the sky, like listeners forever mid-prayer. Thalon met him at the dock. He looked unchanged, still carrying his lyre, still smiling in that way that held more questions than answers. You came, Thalon said. I wasn't sure why, Theseus replied. You didn't need to be sure, Thalon said softly. You only needed to listen. The temple of the Silent Mother stood at the center of Delos, surrounded by olive groves and wild rosemary. Its steps were cracked. Moss crept between the stone blocks. The wind moved easily through the empty colonnades. Inside, the altar was bare, not ruined, just forgotten. A priestess knelt there, old as driftwood, her robes gray with time. When Theseus approached, she did not rise. She only reached out and touched the thread on his wrist. This temple once sang, she whispered, not with music, but with stillness. Now even silence has left us. Theseus sat beside her on the cold floor. What do you need? He asked. The priestess closed her eyes. We need someone to remember. So he did. He stayed 3 days in the temple. He did not speak often. He swept the steps, carried water from the well, sat with the priestess at dusk, and watched the shadows change shape across the floor. At night, he lit a small lamp at the altar and listened to the wind slide through the columns like the breath of something ancient, long asleep. On the second night, he dreamt of Ariadne, not as he left her, standing on a shore with her cloak pulled tight, but younger, running barefoot through a grove, laughing, her hands reaching out to catch light between leaves. She didn't speak, but her eyes said, "It's not too late to return." He woke before dawn. The dream still curled in his chest like smoke. On the fourth morning, a young girl came to the temple. She had never been there before. She had heard stories, but they had faded like old songs. Still, she had followed her grandmother's words and found the stone path. When she entered, Theseus was there, sitting by the altar, whittling a tiny wooden olive branch. Is it true, the girl asked shyly, that gods used to live here? Theseus looked up, smiled softly. They still do, just very quietly. She sat beside him. Will they speak again? He handed her the olive carving. Only if we learn to listen again. By evening, more children came, then elders, then neighbors. No great festival was called. No fire was lit. But the temple began to breathe again. People brought flowers, old poems, baskets of fruit. Someone sang. Someone else laughed. The priestess sat straighter than she had in years, and the silence returned, not the empty kind, but the kind that listens. On the fifth day, Thalon found Theseus in the grove beside the temple, watching the wind move through the grass. She would be proud, the bard said quietly. Theseus didn't ask who. He knew. I left her, he said, not with cruelty, but with unfinished hands. Thalon nodded. Then finish. Theseus left Delos at sunset. The people came to see him off. No cheers, no songs, only gentle waves and nods of farewell. The temple bell chimed once, low and warm, and he felt it in his chest. The sea welcomed him again. But this time, he sailed not toward Athens. He turned south, toward Naxos. Naxos rose from the sea like a sleeping lion, its cliffs soft with moss and thyme. The boat rocked gently in the shallows as Theseus stepped onto the shore, his sandals pressing into sand he had once left behind without a backward glance. The air was thick with the scent of cypress and thyme. The island was quiet, quieter than he remembered, but not empty. There were footprints along the shore, the faint trace of smoke curling from behind the hill, a woven basket resting beneath a fig tree, filled with herbs and small green fruit. He walked without hurry. Each step forward was a question. Would she be there? Would she speak? Would he? At the edge of a grove, where olive trees twisted like sleeping dancers, he found a small house built of sun-bleached stone. A low wall surrounded a garden of lavender and rosemary. A goat slept near the door. A clay bowl rested on the windowsill, still half full of rainwater. He stood there for a moment, not moving. The house was alive in the quiet way old places are, worn gently by time, touched often by memory. Then the door opened. She stood there, Ariadne. Her hair was longer, pulled back with a single braid. She wore a tunic of soft gray, and her hands were stained faintly with soil and petals. She did not look surprised. Her eyes met his with a stillness deeper than the sea. "You came," she said simply. "I wasn't sure I should," he replied. "And yet you did." He stepped closer, but not too close. The silence between them was not cruel. It was delicate, like lace, woven from things left unsaid. "I left you here," he said at last. Ariadne nodded. "Yes. I didn't mean to abandon you. I know. I told myself you chose to stay. I did," she said. "But I also waited." The wind moved between them, rustling the leaves. "I should have returned sooner," he said. Ariadne looked down at her hands. "I would not have been ready." They stood in silence, watching the sky shift above the trees. A few birds flitted past, calling softly to one another. "Why now?" she asked. Theseus unwrapped the thread from his wrist and held it out. It was frayed at one end, but still intact. "I wanted to know," he said, "if it still leads anywhere." She stepped forward and took it, ran her fingers along the length. "Do you expect it to take you back?" she asked. "No," he said, "only forward." Ariadne breathed in slowly, as if tasting the air for truth. "I built this place with my hands," she said, motioning to the small house. "Planted every herb. Learned to speak to the bees. It's quiet here. I am not a princess anymore. Just a woman who knows how to listen." Theseus nodded. "That is who I came to see." A soft smile touched her lips. Not full, not triumphant, but real. "Then come," she said. "You can help me gather water." The path to the well wound through a sunlit trail of ferns and scattered stones. They walked side by side, saying little, but their silence had changed. It no longer held the weight of things undone. It made space, for breath, for memory, for something new. At the well, Ariadne dropped a wooden pail and pulled the rope hand over hand. The water that rose was cool and clear. She dipped a cloth into it, wrung it out, and pressed it to his hands. "You still carry dust," she said gently. Theseus chuckled softly. "Athens is full of it." "Then leave it here a while." They sat on a low wall beside the well, the pail between them. Theseus looked out at the horizon, where the sea shimmered like glass. "Do you ever wish you'd gone with me?" Ariadne was quiet. Then, "No. I needed to become someone I could live with, not just someone you could love." He nodded. "I thought I was saving you from Crete," he said. "But I see now, you were already saving yourself." She smiled again, wider this time. "I was afraid I'd become only a thread in your story." "But you're more," he said. "You always were." They sat until the sun began to lean westward. The breeze picked up, and with it, the scent of citrus and sea. When they returned to the house, she opened a small jar of honey and cut bread into slices. They ate in the garden, surrounded by the slow humming of bees and the long shadows of afternoon. No promises were made, no futures were planned. But when the stars came out, and the world curled into itself like a resting bird, Theseus laid his head on the stone just outside the door and Ariadne brought him a blanket. "Sleep," she said, and he did, not as a king, not as a hero, just as a man who had finally stopped walking. The days on Naxos came and went like petals falling in slow circles, soft, quiet, and without the need to be counted. Theseus stayed not as a guest, not as a king in hiding, but as a man learning again how to live without a sword at his hip or the weight of a city on his shoulders. Ariadne did not ask when he would return to Athens. He did not ask if she wished him to stay. The mornings were filled with small things: sweeping leaves from the stone steps, picking lemons, baking flat rounds of bread that crackled when broken. Theseus learned how to spot the wild thyme Ariadne used in her stews. He learned which bees could be followed to their hives and which would sting if watched too long. There was no need for thrones here. No one bowed. No one commanded. Even the sea seemed slower in this corner of the world, its waves brushing the shore like a hand smoothing linen before sleep. Theseus built a bench beneath the olive tree near her garden. He carved it with care, shaping the wood as he had once shaped stone and strategy. Ariadne came out one afternoon, fingers stained with fig juice, and found him sanding the armrest. "You're a quiet builder," she said. "I used to be a loud one," he replied with a half smile, "but the noise never made things stronger." She sat beside him. "And now I let the wood speak first." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sky for a long time. No words passed. They weren't needed. That night, Ariadne lit a single oil lamp and placed it in the window. The wind nudged the flame gently, as if curious. Theseus watched from the doorway. "I've never seen you afraid," he said softly. "I've been afraid every day," she answered. "But I stopped letting it decide what I do." He stepped closer, gently running a hand through her long, dark hair. "You are braver than any hero," he whispered. She looked up. "Heroes usually leave?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took her hand and led her outside. The stars had bloomed fully now, scattered like promises across the sky. He pointed upward. "Pick one," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "So I can follow it, if you're ever lost." She laughed, quiet and surprised. Then she pointed. "That one." Theseus looked. "It's not the brightest," he noted. "No," she agreed. "But it's the one that doesn't move, even when the world spins." The seasons shifted gently, like a shawl being draped across the shoulders of the hills. The winds grew cooler, the figs sweetened, the evenings carried longer shadows. One morning, while walking the coastal path, Theseus met a fisherman who knew his name. The man did not bow. He simply offered a nod and a question. "Do you miss it?" Theseus blinked. "Miss what?" "The weight," the fisherman said, "of being known." Theseus looked out at the sea, the same sea that had once carried him to Crete, to Athens, to Delos, and now here. "No," he said, after a long while. "I think being known too loudly makes it harder to hear your own voice." The fisherman grinned. "Then you've chosen a good island." Later that week, a traveler arrived, an old friend of Ariadne's from Crete, now gray at the temples, with a basket of sea salt and stories from the southern ports. He stayed for 2 nights, and on the second evening, the 3 of them sat beneath the fig tree, sipping warm wine. The man turned to Theseus. "They still speak of you, you know, in Athens, in Delos, even in Mycenae. The boy who walked into a maze and walked back out." Theseus shrugged lightly. "I didn't walk out alone." Ariadne looked over the rim of her cup, her smile quiet. The man chuckled. "You always were humble, they say." Theseus shook his head. Number I was just never as strong as the stories. When the man left at dawn, he placed a small shell in Theseus's hand. "If ever you sail again," he said, "drop this into the water. It will remind the sea who you are." Theseus held it gently and pocketed it without a word. On the first night of the full moon, Ariadne prepared a small feast. Roasted lamb, bread baked with olives, cheese wrapped in fig leaves. She placed candles in hollowed stones and sang while she cooked. Theseus watched from the doorway, struck by the way light moved in her hair. That evening, they sat side by side, sharing food, laughter, and glances that said more than speech ever could. "You've changed," she told him softly. "I hope so. Not everyone does." Theseus looked down at his hands, rough and steady. "Maybe that's why the gods gave us stories, to remind us we can." A long silence followed. Then Ariadne reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "No matter where you go," she said, "I want you to carry one truth." "What is it?" "That you came back." He squeezed her hand gently. "I never really left," he whispered, and the moon above them, round and golden, listened without judgment. The mornings grew slower as the winds changed. Autumn tiptoed across the hills of Naxos, with her breath cool and steady, brushing the leaves with bronze and whispering to the fig trees that it was time to rest. Theseus woke one morning to find the first layer of dew silvering the garden. The rosemary had curled at its edges. The sky was cloudless, but the air hinted at distance, like a letter half read, waiting to be folded. He stood for a while on the stone steps, watching the smoke from Ariadne's morning fire rise gently into the stillness. She had been up before him, as always, already tending to the bread and the herbs and the soft rituals of their quiet life. Inside the house, the hearth crackled faintly. Ariadne was kneeling near it, placing fresh kindling among the embers with a rhythm born of practice and care. She looked up as he entered, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You sleep lightly," she said with a knowing smile. "I sleep gratefully," he replied. They shared breakfast in the courtyard, warm bread with honey, a pomegranate split carefully down the center. They ate slowly, as if time were something they had finally learned not to chase. "I may go to the western grove today," Ariadne said between bites. "The olives are nearly ready." "I'll come with you," Theseus offered. She smiled, but shook her head. "You've been walking the southern cliffs these mornings, I can tell." He gave a sheepish nod. "There's something about the wind there. It knows stories." "Then walk with it," she said gently. "It might have something left to tell you." The cliffs of southern Naxos were bare and beautiful, jagged and rising like the ribs of sleeping giants. The waves below crashed with patience, not fury. Theseus walked the edge in silence, letting the breeze wrap around him like a long-forgotten voice. He sat on a flat stone near the highest point, where the sea stretched endlessly, the horizon a soft blur of sky and longing. From his cloak, he pulled the small shell given to him by the traveler from Delos. He turned it over in his hand, the lines etched by time and salt, the spiral perfect in its quiet defiance. "Who am I now?" he asked aloud, not to the wind, but to himself. He did not expect an answer, but the waves, steady as breath, seemed to whisper one anyway. A man, not a prince, not a slayer of beasts, not a hero carved in marble, just a man. And for the first time, that felt like enough. When he returned to the house at dusk, Ariadne had lit candles along the wall, small flames glowing in hollowed stones, their light soft and flickering against the wind. She was in the garden, picking herbs with her bare hands, humming a melody older than memory. He joined her without speaking, kneeling beside her in the darkening earth. "You always come back with silence in your pockets," she said, brushing soil from her palms, "because you fill them with peace." She looked at him then, really looked, and her eyes, the color of twilight, held a question she had not asked in years. "Will you ever leave again?" Theseus reached into his cloak and pulled out the shell. "I think," he said slowly, "I've stopped running from places." She took the shell from his hand, traced its spiral. "I like the idea of you staying," she said. "Not forever, but long enough for the garden to remember your footsteps." He leaned closer. "Then I'll walk softly." That evening, they built a fire on the beach. Not for warmth, not for celebration, but because sometimes the heart needs a flame that asks nothing of it. They sat beside it, wrapped in blankets. The stars stretched above like an old song. The sea whispered behind them. "Theseus," Ariadne said quietly, "do you ever think about the maze?" He was silent for a moment. "Not the walls," he said, "but the thread, the way it followed me. Never pulling, never pushing, just waiting." She nodded, like time, or forgiveness. The fire crackled. Sparks danced upward, vanishing into the dark. "I used to believe the labyrinth was a place," she said, "but now I think it was a part of us, something we carried inside." Theseus turned toward her. "And you?" "I found my way out," she said softly. "Not all at once, but step by step." He placed a hand over hers. "So did I." Later, when the fire dimmed to a warm glow, Ariadne leaned into him. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore," she said. "You don't need to be," he replied. "You've lit too many lamps." They stayed until the last ember faded, not speaking, not needing to, because the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. Rain came to Naxos softly that week. It did not roar or rush. It simply arrived one morning, dripping from fig leaves and collecting in tiny puddles along the stone path. The sky turned to silver silk. The garden breathed deeper. And the olive trees, rooted and patient, welcomed the gentle soak as if it were an old friend finally returned. Theseus watched the rain from the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, the other loosely holding a clay cup of warm milk and honey. Ariadne was inside, stringing herbs above the hearth, rosemary, lavender, and thyme, each bunch tied with soft twine, each hung with care. "I used to hate the rain," he murmured. Ariadne didn't turn. "Because it slowed you down?" "No," he said, "because it made me feel like I had to be still, and I didn't know how." She glanced over her shoulder, a small smile on her lips. "And now?" He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Now," he said, setting down the cup, "I let it speak." They spent that day in the quiet rhythm that rain invites, slow chopping of root vegetables, warm broth bubbling over the fire, pages of a well-worn book turned between sips of tea. Ariadne stitched the edge of a linen sheet that had begun to fray. Theseus polished the old wooden bench he'd made, smoothing its arms like one tends to memories. No one spoke of the future. There was no need. The present had made enough room for them both. In the evening, when the rain turned to mist, they stepped outside together, cloaks wrapped around their shoulders. The garden shimmered. The world smelled of wet stone and clean earth. Theseus looked up at the moon, dimmed but present, and said, "Do you ever think about Athens?" Ariadne took a breath, slow and deep. "Only in the way one thinks about a house they once lived in. It doesn't belong to me anymore, but I remember where the windows were. He nodded. And you? She asked. Will you go back? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched to lift a small snail from the pathway and set it gently among the thyme. I think, he said finally, that some places stay in you more than you stay in them. Athens was loud, beautiful, full of need. But here, I hear myself think. Ariadne watched him. Then perhaps this is not a pause. No, he said, rising to meet her eyes. Perhaps it's a return. That night, the fire was low and golden. They sat side by side on the bench, sharing the last of the roasted chestnuts. The silence between them was no longer the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of belonging. Theseus, Ariadne said quietly, I have something for you. She rose and walked to the hearth, reaching behind the stack of firewood. When she returned, she held a small wooden box. Its lid was carved with waves, its edges worn smooth by time. He took it in his hands, opened it slowly. Inside, nestled in folds of faded linen, was the coil of silver thread, the same thread. His breath caught. He looked up. You kept it? He asked. I couldn't throw it away, she said, even when I wanted to forget. It was always more than a tool. He touched it with care. It was hope and memory, and maybe something we didn't have a name for. Ariadne nodded, and it still is. He closed the box gently and held it to his chest. I didn't come back for this, he said. I know, but I think I needed to hold it again. The next morning, the rain was gone. The world was washed and clear, every leaf shimmering, every branch proud. Birds returned to the olive trees. The bees resumed their slow, looping flight between blossoms. Ariadne packed a small basket with bread, olives, cheese, and dried figs. Theseus filled 2 flasks with fresh spring water. They took the long path that led along the cliffs, winding through patches of wildflowers and past stone cairns left by travelers who had come and gone before them. At the top of the highest rise, they stopped. From there, the sea stretched like forever. I used to think the sea had no memory, Theseus said, watching the waves. Ariadne sat down beside him. And now I think it remembers everything. Just gently. They ate in silence, the breeze wrapping around them like a song with no words. Afterward, Theseus reached into his pouch and drew out the shell the Delian traveler had given him. He turned it over once in his palm, then walked to the edge. He looked back at Ariadne, who gave a soft nod. Then, with both hands, he cast it into the sea. The shell arced in the sunlight and disappeared with a soft splash. A promise fulfilled, not of return, but of peace. That evening, they lit no fire. They needed no warmth, only the stars, and they came, one by one, like slow footsteps across the sky. Ariadne leaned against Theseus's shoulder. He rested his hand atop hers, and together they watched the constellations change, knowing they had changed too. Not into something new, but into something true. Winter on Naxos did not arrive with frost or thunder. It came gently, as everything did on the island, with a hush in the trees and longer pauses between bird calls. The olive grove stood bare and quiet. The wind took on a thoughtful chill. Fires were no longer for light alone. They became the heart of every home. Theseus and Ariadne moved through the season with unspoken rhythm. Mornings began with warm bread and ended with slow laughter beside the hearth. She wove new blankets from wool dyed in dusk blue and rust brown. He carved small boxes from olive wood, each one different, each one smooth to the touch, as though shaped not by blade, but by patience. One box he set on the windowsill, empty. For what? Ariadne asked. For whatever we forget to name, he replied. She nodded and placed a sprig of thyme inside. The days shortened. Shadows stretched across the floor earlier and earlier. But inside their house, there was no rush, no need to fill the dark. The quiet became part of them, like a third voice that whispered only when they both fell still. One evening, while stringing dried fruit near the fire, Ariadne looked up and said, "Do you ever miss it?" Theseus didn't ask what it meant. He simply answered, "I miss the boy I was, when I believed every step forward had to be loud." She smiled. "You've walked softer since. I learned from you." A pause, then gently, "And do you miss the stories?" He thought for a long time. "I used to want to be remembered," he said, "but now I want to remember." "Remember what?" He looked around the room, the shadows moving gently across the stone walls, the thread box glowing faintly in lamplight, the woman before him whose presence was no longer a miracle but a part of his breath. "This," he said, "just this." On the last day of the year, they climbed the hill above their home, where an old cypress tree had grown sideways from the wind and stone. Beneath it, Ariadne laid out a cloth and 2 small cups of spiced wine. The sea was quiet, the sky open and pale, like a beginning not yet written. Theseus sat beside her, the wool of his cloak wrapped around them both. "I had a dream last night," Ariadne said. "Was I in it?" "No," she replied, "but the wind was." He chuckled. "Then I must have been close." She took his hand and pressed something into it. It was a new thread, woven from flax, and dyed a deep, warm red. Software subtle, strong. "I made this," she said, "not to guide you out, but to remind you that you're here." He tied it gently around his wrist, beside the faded silver one. "2 threads," he whispered. "One that brought me back, and one that tells me I stayed." That night, a storm passed far offshore. They watched it from the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, listening to thunder roll softly over the sea like distant drums in a forgotten parade. No rain reached them, only the light, only the hush that follows thunder when the world remembers to breathe. In the days that followed, travelers occasionally passed through. A shepherd seeking shelter from wind, a painter in search of sky. None stayed long, but each, in some way, left lighter than when they had come. Some recognized Theseus. He never denied who he was. But when they asked for stories, he told them not of minotaurs or labyrinths, but of how time tastes when dried above a winter fire, or how quiet can grow in the spaces between footsteps. He spoke not to be remembered, but to offer rest. And slowly, even the travelers stopped asking. One evening in early spring, when the bees had just begun to hum again and the garden yawned with tiny green shoots, Ariadne came in from the grove, holding a small stone in her palm. It was smooth and gray, shaped like a tear. She placed it on the mantel. Theseus looked at it. "A gift?" "No," she said. Wait. For what?" "For the stories we never told." He didn't move it. It stayed there ever after, just beneath the thread box, just beside the flame. Years passed like waves, one after another, soft and certain. No bells marked the days, no scrolls recorded their names. But the path from the door to the olive tree wore deeper. The fig branches stretched wider. And in a village not far from the coast, when children asked the old woman who lived near the cliffs who she would smile and say, "Someone who once held the end of a thread." When they asked about the quiet man with the calm eyes who carved shapes from wood, she would laugh softly and say, "He's someone who once followed it." And that was enough. When at last the fire in the hearth grew low for the final time, and the stars outside blinked gently in their eternal hush. No one wept, no gods came, no songs were sung, but a breeze passed through the olive grove, warm, familiar. It brushed the garden, touched the windowsill, and lifted just slightly the lid of a small wooden box. Inside it, the thread curled peacefully, still and shining, not waiting, not guiding, just being. And so, dear listener, that brings our journey to a gentle close. From the whispering olive groves of Trozen to the silent turning halls of the Labyrinth. From the distant shorelines of Crete to the quiet windswept hills of Naxos, we've walked beside Theseus not as a fierce warrior, but as a thoughtful soul, learning not just how to slay monsters, but how to live, how to listen, and how to return. This was never just a story of a hero and a beast. It was about finding your way in the dark, not with rage or noise, but with stillness, with thread, with memory. It was about letting go of the roar of the world and following something softer, something truer. And as Theseus stepped away from legend and into life, as he laid down his sword and picked up a simple wooden box or tied a thread not to escape, but to stay, maybe something inside you also settled. Maybe something in your heart remembered how to rest. Because sometimes we all need a place like Naxos, a place to sit quietly beside someone who understands, a place where the stars blink slowly, where the sea whispers, where nothing more needs to be said. Before we part tonight, I want to thank you, truly, for spending this time with me and for choosing this story before sleep. It means a lot to have you here. If this tale brought you even a moment of peace, I'd be so grateful if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel so that together we can keep building a quiet little space in this loud world for stories, for dreams, for breath. Now, wherever you are, whether your eyes are already heavy or still lingering in thought, I hope this night wraps you in calm and that your dreams come softly. May your sleep be deep, your mind be still, and your heart be light. Thank you again. Good night. And sweet, sweet dreams.